All right, kiddos. So we are going to talk about your chapter atlas for your chapter for Central America and the Caribbeans. I'm super excited for you guys to read this chapter. I just think it'll be interesting to learn about. I think it's an area that we don't talk about very often. So Central America really connects like North America and South America, and it separates the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It includes places like Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Some geographers also include the southern parts of Mexico. Central America is an isthmus, which is like a strip of land that has water on both sides that connects two larger bodies of island. Or bodies of land, sorry. So the isthmus is divided by the Panama Canal, which is human made and was designed for trade routes between the Atlantic and Pacific, and that'll be important in later parts of your chapter. So, to the east of Central America, we have the Caribbean Sea and hundreds of islands. There's Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola. Those are like the largest Caribbean islands, but there's a lot of smaller ones that were formed by volcanoes. You've got a lot of mountain regions as well. The highest peak is probably in the Dominican Republic. You've got some mountains that are high enough to be covered with snow in the winter, which I think is surprising for a lot of us considering we like to think about most of those places as being pretty warm. But they're high enough, the altitude's high enough that they get cold enough to have snow. They have a lot of precipitation in Central America, especially in the highlands, that really create important lakes and rivers that they use for many things. There's really slow but steady movements of the plates below the Earth's surface that actually make Central America like really unstable. So the Central America and the Caribbean region has more than 80 active volcanoes because of all of these plates that are constantly moving. There's one in Guatemala that's probably the most active. There's one that erupted back in 1997, and much of that city that was nearby is still closed today. And most of the people that lived near that volcano actually moved away. Earthquakes are also a really big problem in Central America and the Caribbean. They can also lead to mudslides, which are really dangerous and destroy tons of property. There's a city of San Salvador in El Salvador that has been completely destroyed by earthquakes and rebuilt several times, like many times. It's gotten destroyed, rebuilt, because of earthquakes. In 2001, there was an earthquake there that destroyed 100,000 homes. In Antigua, Guatemala, there are like roofless buildings and other ruins that are like kind of there as a reminder of a really powerful earthquake that happened back in 1773 and destroyed many buildings there. As far as like climate goes, it's pretty wet and warm because it's so close to the equator and because it's so close to both oceans. So you get a lot of warm east winds that are called trade winds that bring a lot of rain into the region. The rains provide water for the forests and the tropical crops like banana and coffee beans. When the trade winds make really bad rainstorms, that's when you get hurricanes. And that happens often there in that area as well. They have higher areas in Central America. We kind of talked about the highlands just briefly, but they have like a dry and rainy season because of the mountains. So the mountains can actually block the trade winds. So they end up with less rain in the winter months, and that lack of rain between December and April can really lead to water shortages. So those areas really can't support tropical life because of those dry months, but they do get used often for cattle ranching. They're pretty densely populated. Most people that live in Central America live in the highlands because they like the dry, cool climate. The climate allows people to grow a variety of crops, so it has some perks. Caribbean countries usually have lower elevation, so those climates are similar to the lower areas of Central America. Because it's so warm and wet, it's very tropical and subtropical all over both Central America and the Caribbeans. The tropical rainforests cover most areas that haven't been cleared of trees. Tropical grasslands are kind of forming where trees were cut down, which is kind of interesting. Places like Costa Rica have like a really rare ecosystem that's called a cloud forest, and like the land is higher and it's a lot cooler there, so you actually end up with these really low hanging clouds that are close to the ground, and they're really moist, and so they end up being able to support a ton of different wildlife, which is pretty amazing. A lot of the Caribbean islands are surrounded by the underwater ecosystem known as the coral reef. So reefs are like mostly made up of organisms, coral, that produce like it's this substance that's kind of similar to limestone. Limestone is used to build a lot of buildings. And so over time, the coral reefs have become this like giant home to a huge variety of like ocean life and animal plants, and just, I wish I could show you guys a picture right now. I might post one. But if I don't, you should look it up, because the coral reef is like this explosion of color when you think of all of the underwater plants and animals that live there. They're actually in danger right now because of a lot of pollution. But really, they're remarkable. The variety of living things that are able to be there is called biodiversity in your textbooks. So basically, an area that has a wide range of living things is going to be a biodiverse area. So hurricanes, they are a huge problem for them there. And so basically they really face hurricanes every year. In Honduras, they face an average of 8 hurricanes a year. And so they usually occur in the summer and in the early fall. The storms are crazy. They bring tons of rain every hour, as well as insane winds that harm a lot of buildings, but also people and animals and plant life that are there. It's interesting because recently the hurricanes have become stronger and more frequent. So sometimes scientists think that this is because of higher air and sea temperatures, basically climate change. So we've talked about that quite a bit in class. And they believe that these increases in hurricanes are due to that. Hurricanes are obviously very dangerous for everyone involved. And at the end of the day, really these countries cannot afford to rebuild after it all gets destroyed. So they're really relying on like the International Red Cross, the Red Crescent movement, those kind of global efforts to help them rebuild after every single hurricane, which is a lot to have to rely on other people for. So when we think about the way they use their land, even though they have hurricanes and earthquakes, people have still found ways to live off the land. So you end up with very few natural resources because the land is so small. So if they don't have necessarily the same access to like massive amounts of trees and things like that like we might have, the access to trees that they have are in the rainforest, and the rainforests are protected, and we want to protect them. So they don't have the same amount due to the small space that their land is on. They do have farms there. They grow a lot of tropical things. They have done some mining, like in Jamaica, they do a lot of mining for a mineral that gets used in aluminum. It produces like some petroleum, but most of the oil they have to import from other countries, which is expensive. So in the lowlands, they're able to grow pretty well. They have a lot of cash crops like sugar and coffee, and they do a lot of tropical things like bananas that we talked about earlier. So much of the food that's eaten in the region, though, outside of those things is actually imported from other countries because they want to use their cash crops to be able to sell it to other areas. So they might keep what they need for their house, but then they sell the rest overseas. So a lot of the food that's eaten there is actually imported from other countries. So in a lot of places where it's too dry, that's where you end up with your cattle ranchers. But there is some issues with cattle ranching because it causes a lot of erosion, which is not something they really want, considering their space is already small. They don't really want to remove more of the soil with wind and water. Economic wise, like tourism is a huge factor for them. It's really their main source of income for the country. And so they have lots of people that want to come and dive in the coral reefs and swim with dolphins and, go for tours in the rainforest. And some things from that are great, but there's also a cost. First of all, it's difficult because when you know that there are lots of hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanoes, those things can keep tourism away. So you have times where you're making money and times where you're not. It's not very reliable. Another problem is that they already have issues with water shortages. And so then when you have all these tourist places that are coming, they have even more water shortages because they're happening. The biggest tourist time is during their dry season anyways. And so they're not getting the water that they need. There's also a lot of pollution issues. With many things, we've got the issues with the tourism and, just the general cars and air flight travel and those kinds of things that can cause pollution. But also, like, their large scale farming causes a lot of pollution too. So they use a lot of like pesticides and chemicals on like a large single crop. So we're not talking about like independent individual farmers here necessarily, but like your people that are growing these giant cash crops to sell, they tend to use a lot of pesticides and things like that, which can pollute the water supply, which then kills plants and animals. That harms the coral reef a lot. It decreases a lot of the biodiversity, which is a problem because a lot of people go to tour there because they want to see the biodiversity. So that's hurting their economy as well. Some of the polluting is killing a lot of the fish, which is really hard for the people that are trying to fish for a living. That becomes a huge concern for a lot of places, especially Belize and Honduras. Before, like, another big pollution issue would be deforestation. So before a lot of people lived there, basically most of the land was covered by rainforest. The whole thing was. So now that we're centuries later and we've had all this ranching and farming and timbers and all of this, we've had so much of the rainforest just completely cleared out. And that's destroyed so many homes for animals. It's caused a lot of erosion. Without roots in the soil, it can't absorb moisture, and so you're ending up with more landslides and mudslides, and so there's just a lot more issues there, especially with the erosion because the soil gets so dry without the roots to absorb the water that you end up with wind being able to take away a lot of the soil. Haiti actually has the greatest loss of forest as far as that goes. So because of that, it's had really bad effects on their soil, and they're not actually able to grow enough food for the people in their country. So they actually have to rely a lot on other sources. So the loss of habitat has definitely caused a lack in the wildlife diversity, like we talked about a little bit before. So a lot of like, not just with animals, but even with plants. Like there were some medicinal plants that were highly important that have been completely lost from all of this. Some Native American groups also live in the rainforest, and so deforestation means taking their homes from them. So there's just a lot to think about when it comes to that stuff. They have a lot of unique challenges in that area. So yeah, I hope this helps, and I will chit chat with y'all later.